Boeing's latest strike was the most costly labor conflict in the United States for over 25 years, not only because of how long it lasted, but also because of Boeing's central role in the aviation industry. So, what really happened here? What drove Boeing's workers to hold out for nearly 2 months? Well, this strike didn't just come out of the blue. It had actually been building up for many years, and in reality, both that strike and how long it lasted was probably inevitable. Stay tuned. Let's start with talking about some money here. Early estimates suggested that this strike was costing Boeing around $1 billion per month, but some more recent estimates now put the total cost at a whopping $6.5 billion. And that's just Boeing's direct cost. The machinists also collectively lost about $600 million in wages during that same time, and some analysts think that the strike's total effect on the US economy could be as high as $11.5 billion, since other companies also had to reduce shifts and furlough workers. Spirit AeroSystems, Boeing's biggest supplier, even started questioning whether they could survive without financial support. Though, to be fair here, their problems definitely started well before this strike, as I've talked about earlier. Meanwhile, Boeing's airline customers and lessors are now getting really impatient, having to constantly readjust their fleet plans. Boeing's production was already too slow before the strike, and during it they could only really keep up making the 787 since the South Carolina factory who's making those wasn't unionized. So, who is really the bad guy here? Boeing or their striking machinists? Well, in a previous video I promised to look at this story from the workers' point of view, because ultimately this is about loyalty, and loyalty should work both ways, right? Well, to understand all of the nuances here, let's first look at how Boeing's relationships with their workers have changed over the years. I've talked before about the Boeing bust that hit the company back between 1969 and 1971, and that was an absolutely devastating event for Boeing, and it happened for several reasons. Before this period, aircraft technology had been improving incredibly fast, forcing airlines to renew and replace their fleets sometimes almost every few months. But then, in the late 1960s, the airlines decided that they simply couldn't keep up with that anymore. Planes would just need to stay in service much longer, and this meant that the aircraft orders just basically dropped off a cliff pretty much overnight. Unfortunately for Boeing, this happened around the same time that the 747 was supposed to enter service after an extremely costly development program. And at that same time, the Vietnam War was also winding down, affecting every US company that was producing military equipment. And crucially, Boeing then also lost the government support for their 2707, the incredibly ambitious wide-body supersonic transport that was supposed to eclipse the mighty Concorde. The funding for the 2707 was finally cut in December of 1970, and by then Boeing was already in crisis, struggling with a huge amount of debt that they had borrowed to fund all of their various programs. Massive layoffs had started already in 1969, and after the SST was cancelled, things got so bad that Seattle's unemployment rate hit 13.8%, when the national average was just about 4.5%. Now, I know that many of you have heard the basics of this story, but there is something here that often gets overlooked. And that's just how quickly Boeing actually recovered from all of this. Despite the oil crisis making things even worse for aviation in 1973, Boeing was already starting to recover by the mid-1970s. And incredibly, in 1978, less than a decade after those massive layouts had started, Boeing managed to launch 2 new aircraft almost simultaneously, the 757 and the 767. So how did Boeing do this? How did they manage to turn things around so quickly? Well, the usual answer you'll find in most sources is military contracts, and that wasn't completely wrong. Boeing did get contracts for the AWACS and other aircraft during this crucial period, but remember, they also lost military contracts after Vietnam, and even more NASA contracts after the space race had ended. So there must have been another reason for this quick recovery. Now, contracts are great, but you need to be able to ramp up production fast in order to deliver on those. And that means that you have to have the right trained people in the right places when you need them. Boeing's quick recovery depended hugely on its fantastic employees, many of whom actually came back after the Boeing bust, even if that meant relocating a second time, since many had moved away from Seattle during the crisis. And this is something that's probably hard for many in my generation and for those of you who are younger to fully understand. A lot of people in my parents' generation expected that whatever job they got in their 20s would be the job that they would keep for their entire career. Now, their roles might evolve with promotions or a company expansion, but company changes and radical career changes were the exception, not the rule back then, and you supported your employer if you could. This kind of company loyalty largely disappeared during the last decades of the 20th century, but it stuck around much longer in certain industries. Take the automotive industry, for example. In the United States, you'll find multiple generations of the same family, all working for, let's say, Ford, except for that one person, the family black sheep who works for Chevrolet, or the other way around. And Boeing was almost exactly that kind of a company, one that inspired real loyalty from its people, and crucially, this was the kind of loyalty that made people understand and accept that they'd have to tighten their belts when the company went through hard times. People accepted this because they trusted that Boeing would make things right for them as soon as the company recovered and orders started rolling in again, which is exactly what also Boeing did for many of them after the bust. That's the real story behind the "working together" text under the cockpit windows of the first Boeing 777 that rolled out. The quick development and the huge success of that aircraft wasn't just a triumph for Boeing as a company. It was also a very personal triumph for thousands of Boeing workers and their families who saw themselves as Boeing families and had rewarded the company with their loyalty. And then they saw that loyalty just go straight down the drain. But before I tell you about how that happened, when we're on the subject of trust and protection, did you know that there are companies out there known as data brokers who are continuously selling your personal data to the highest bidders? This was something that my lead editor, Dominic, learned the hard way when he started to get a lot of spam sent out to him recently. He did a little bit of digging and found out that data like his social media profiles, emails, and even info about his family was being sold by loads of different companies. But here's where today's sponsor, DeleteMe, comes in. According to their research, the amount of data that every person have available about them online had tripled between 2019 and 2023 to an average of 525 pieces of info per person. And that data is now being either sold for as little as $5 per piece or even given away for free legally by these brokers. But it turns out that you can tell them to stop, and it's just really time consuming to do, since you have to do so one company at a time. So for that, Dominic instead turned to DeleteMe, who offers a hands-free service to help clean your data away from the web. They immediately started hunting down those data brokers and asked them to remove Dominic's data from their services, and DeleteMe also then kept monitoring them for compliance. Apparently this worked really well because Dom could see some real improvement within days of signing up for the service, and that in turn makes me really happy because it means that Dom can now continue concentrating on helping me make great videos with one less thing to worry about. Now, if you want to try the same thing and start cleaning away your data from the web, then use my link here below, which is joindeleteme.com/mentornow, and add the promo code mentornow. That will give you an awesome 20% discount on US consumer plans, and it also directly supports my work. So that's joindeleteme.com/mentornow. Thank you, DeleteMe. Now back to the video. 30 years after the Boeing 777 entered service, the idea that Boeing jobs equals good life just isn't that true anymore. So what actually happened? Well, during this latest strike, a lot of Boeing workers shared their stories in the media and online, and they painted a very bleak picture of how their lives had changed during the past 25 years or so, basically since Boeing absorbed McDonnell Douglas and its managers. That merger happened in 1997, and as I've explained in my Boeing series, A few months back, McDonnell Douglas's bosses, the same people that ultimately caused the fall of that company, basically then took over the management of Boeing after the merger. I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that Boeing's relationship with their workers was perfect before that merger. Boeing has actually had 8 strikes in their history, including the one that just ended, and 5 of those happened before Boeing absorbed McDonnell Douglas. In fact, their longest ever strike, 69 days, happened in 1995, just 2 years before that merger. But the management changes in the 2000s completely changed Boeing's direction. Harry Stonecipher had been the last ever McDonnell Douglas CEO before the 97 merger, and he then took control of Boeing in 2003. After him, Jim McNerney, a General Electric guy with much of the same background as the McDonnell Douglas group, took over the reins of Boeing in 2005, and that's when the real changes started. He then basically initiated an open war with Boeing's workers, especially over the development and production of the Boeing 787. And that led to the 2008 strike, primarily because he decided that Boeing was going to outsource nearly all major 787 aerostructures away from Washington State's Puget Sound and possibly out of the country entirely. But there were also other, equally important changes happening around Puget Sound at that time, because a lot of other big companies were now also getting a foothold in Seattle and the surrounding areas. Now, Microsoft had already moved in decades later, but they didn't really threaten Boeing's position as Seattle's biggest employer. Boeing remained the lifeblood of the Puget Sound region all through the 1980s and 90s, but now gradually Starbucks, Amazon, and many other retail technology, manufacturing and pharmaceutical companies also based themselves in that area. Boeing then moved their headquarters from Seattle to Chicago in 2001, but their main aircraft assembly sites, for airliners at least, stayed in that region. And here is where the plot thickens, because while all of these new companies brought new work opportunities, they also drove up house prices and other living costs. And as Boeing was now effectively under the old McDonnell Douglas management, they simply weren't increasing worker pay to match both inflation and the economic growth of the region. So remember those Boeing families that I mentioned earlier? Well, many of the children from those families in the early 1990s had been encouraged by their parents to get Boeing jobs a decade or so later. You see, Boeing had been in Seattle since 1916, so today there are plenty of families where 3 or even 4 generations have been working for that same company. But many of those parents who still work at Boeing and whose kids grew up and also joined that company in the recent years soon got a shocking realization. Their kids just couldn't have the same type of life quality that their parents, had enjoyed when they joined the company. Before this last strike, the starting pay for a typical job on the factory floor in Everett or Renton, Boeing's 2 aircraft assembly sites, was around $21 an hour, which is about what someone makes working in an Amazon warehouse or as a barista somewhere in Seattle. Jobs at McDonald's in the area start at $19 an hour, just for reference. That Boeing starting pay amounts to around $41,000 per year, and as Scott Hamilton in Liam News has explained in detail, that's not really enough for someone hoping to work at Boeing's Everett factory, or especially the one in Renton, unless these workers are willing to do some long commutes or share apartments with workmates. And that of course means that for people with young families, some really difficult choices might have to be made. New workers at the factory who grew up living comfortable lives as Boeing family children are now struggling to raise their young children in the same way. And I think it's really frustrating to hear these people explain that even if they routinely work overtime, 2 weekends on and 1 weekend off for example, they often need to pick up extra work just so that their kids can have things like a baseball glove. That should be pretty hard to justify for an aircraft manufacturer who is the de facto #1 exporter in the United States. Now, like I said earlier, in previous decades, Boeing workers identified with their company and accepted that they might have to tighten their belts when things were hard. And in recent years, things for Boeing obviously have been hard. You have the 737 MAX troubles, the 787 production issues, the 777X certification, the 737 MAX blowout, plus a whole bunch of military and space program problems. But the Stone cipher, and especially the McNerney era and how they handled their worker interactions, means that there is now zero sympathy for Boeing's management among these workers. Especially after McNerney set up a second 787 production line away from Washington State, and then basically blackmailed the machinists to give up their company pensions, as well as a lot of other things, like I explained recently. And here's something that really shows the attitude of Boeing's leadership back then. In 2014, a few months after McNerney secured those devastating concessions from his workers, a reporter asked if he was thinking about retiring soon, since he was about to turn 65, typically the age limit for Boeing CEOs. And McNerney's response? Well, he said he wouldn't retire at 65 because the heart will still be beating, the employees will still be cowering. And that wasn't just some casual chat with a journalist. He said this during an investor call. Now, he later apologized, calling it a bad joke and saying that he was just making fun of his own age. But remember, this is the same guy who compared his management style to Darth Vader's. He had also replaced Boeing's old motto of working together with do more with less. And he was also the one that launched and oversaw the development of the 737 MAX until finally retiring in 2015, taking home $29 million as its last total annual pay. Add to this that Boeing also paid out billions in stock buybacks and other reforms designed to benefit the shareholders during that time, and they say that you reap what you sow. And I'm sure that you can now understand why the employees who were there 10 years ago when McNerney made these remarks after taking away their pensions were in absolutely no mood to leave anything on the table during these last union negotiations with Boeing. Sure, Boeing now has a new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, who has nothing to do with those old hawks from either McDonnell Douglas or General Electric, but that didn't really matter. There was just too much anger and disappointment in the company with good cause. That's also why Scott Hamilton in Leham News analyzed the demographic of Boeing's machinists. The long-time veterans wanted these pensions back, and they'd actually saved up for a full 3-month-long strike. Those veterans make up about 40% of the IAM 751 union membership and were openly excited to finally get a chance to fight with Boeing. Now, younger or newer employees might think differently, depending on their patience, their ability to save up for a strike, or whether they could find temporary work elsewhere. But Hamilton believed that those who lived through the previous contract wouldn't accept anything less than getting their full pensions back. And it looks like he was absolutely right. Boeing's final offer that the machinists voted on November the 4th did not include a return to those defined benefit pension plans. The vote went 59% in favor, meaning 41% of the workers, or about the same percentage as those long-term employees, rejected the offer. Of course, this doesn't mean that Boeing got away with an easy contract. Far from it. The machinists got a 38% pay rise, which would actually work out a bit higher over the life of the contract. And there's also a signing bonus of $12,000, an annual performance bonus of up to 6%, but no less than 4%, and improvement in health plans and 401k retirement plans. But in reality here, Boeing actually needed to offer these increases in order to remain competitive as an employer in Puget Sound. In fact, even with these latest contracts, increases in starting wages remain quite low, though workers can now look forward to quicker progression than before. I've previously looked at how Boeing had to secure funds during the strike to eliminate any doubts that they could actually continue operating through the crisis. And with that, and the strike now being behind them, Boeing's new CEO can finally move forward with fixing the company, and believe me, there is plenty of fixing to do. Like I said at the start, this is really a story about loyalty, and loyalty goes both ways. If Boeing want to become a healthy company again, they need to restore the culture that once made that loyalty possible. Now here's something interesting. on October the 23rd, right in the middle of the strike, Boeing presented their third quarter results, and during that presentation, Ortberg outlined 4 areas where Boeing needed to change. He said, first, we need a fundamental culture change in the company. Second, we must stabilize the business. Third, we need to improve our execution discipline on new platform commitments across the company. And fourth, while doing the first 3, we must build a new future for Boeing. Focusing on culture, Ortberg added that Boeing was once a benchmark for what good culture looks like, adding that culture changes start at the top. Now that's strong words, and those words now need to be followed up by actions. 4 days after the vote that ended the strike, Ortberg announced that Boeing employees who were furloughed during the strike would be repaid for their lost wages. These furloughs had only affected the non-union employees who weren't on strike during those 7+ weeks. And this got positive feedback from some employees, but it did not change the other decision that Boeing made in October, which was to reduce the worldwide workforce of the company by 10% over the next few months. Arguably, those job cuts are part of Ortberg's second step, stabilizing the business, which could also include broader changes in how the civil, military and aftermarket parts of Boeing are organized. So it looks like Ortberg and Boeing now have a lot of work to do before we can start talking about the fourth step, building a new future for Boeing, which simply have to include a new aircraft. Now, I'm going to end this video with this thought here. In general, it seems like the workers got a decent deal out of this contract. They didn't get those original pensions back, and that's likely because companies in the US and almost everywhere else have generally moved away from defined benefit pension plans. But what do you think would have happened if back in September, before the strike began, Boeing had offered its employees this exact same contract? Would they have accepted it as a first Boeing offer, or would they have held out for even more? I think they would have done the latter, which is why I think that ultimately this long-winded strike was unavoidable, because Boeing were now reaping what they had been sowing for over 2.5 decades. I believe that ultimately these workers really want their company to return to its glory days, but it wasn't just the company itself that did well back then. The workers did too, and maybe there is a lesson in that. What do you think? Was there a way to avoid this strike that I'm missing? Let me know in the comments below. Please also remember to subscribe to the channel if you think that I have earned it, and check out my sponsor if you want to support what I do. You can also join my Patreon crew if you want to see these videos before everyone else, and also even affect its content. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!